He conquered more land than anyone in history before his 33rd birthday, tamed a horse that kicked grown men into submission, built cities across 3 continents, and yet, every single morning, he had to answer the same question as the rest of us. What's for breakfast? Was it roasted peacock on golden plates, served by trembling Persian servants? Was it whatever his soldiers shot, skinned, and dropped into a boiling pot? Or was it, on most days, a bowl of something that looked exactly like what you'd feed to someone you mildly disliked? Before we open the royal pantry and dig through the leftovers of the ancient world's most ambitious man, hit that like button if you're ready to eat like a conqueror, and subscribe if you want more history that actually tastes good. And in the comments tell me, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever eaten? Because I promise you, it's nothing compared to what Alexander put in his mouth. Now, let's set the table. Imagine a world without forks, without refrigerators, without pizza delivery at 2 a.m. Imagine leading 50,000 men across deserts and still needing to figure out lunch. This is the story of what fueled the man who fueled an empire. Long before he was Alexander the Great, before the battles that became legend, before the empires that crumbled at his feet, he was just a boy with a bowl in front of him and a father watching from across the table. And that bowl, on most mornings, contained something that looked less like breakfast and more like a test. The Macedonian court was not a place of soft cushions and warm bread. It was a fortress of men who believed that comfort was the first enemy of greatness. And so young Alexander sat down each morning to a meal designed not to please him, but to prepare him. Boiled barley porridge, grey and thick, the kind of food that filled your stomach and asked nothing of your gratitude. Goat cheese, aged to the point of sharpness, crumbled over bread that could, in a pinch, be used as a weapon. Olives, bitter and brine-soaked, the kind you didn't eat so much as endure. And wine, but wine so diluted with water that it barely qualified. This was breakfast. This was childhood. But here's what you need to understand about that bowl of porridge. It wasn't accidental. Philip, his father, knew exactly what he was doing. He had seen what happened to kings who raised their sons on honey and cream. They grew soft. They grew entitled. They grew into men who expected the world to feed them rather than men who would starve before they surrendered. So Philip fed his son a meal that built calluses on the inside. Every spoonful was a lesson. You are not special because of your birth. You are special because of what you can endure. And Alexander endured. He ate without complaint because complaining wasn't an option. He chewed that dense bread and swallowed those bitter olives because the alternative was looking weak in front of a father who had zero tolerance for weakness. But here's the part that haunts me, the part that makes that simple breakfast feel heavier than it should. Philip wasn't just building a soldier, he was building a weapon. And weapons don't need to enjoy their food, they need to function. So imagine that boy, sitting there in the cold Macedonian morning, the fire barely taking the chill off the room, eating a meal that any peasant would recognize. He didn't know yet that he would conquer the world. He didn't know that his name would echo for millennia. All he knew was that the bread was hard, the cheese was sharp, and his father's eyes were on him, always on him. Was there warmth in that kitchen? Was there a mother's hand smoothing the rough edges of that porridge? History doesn't say. What it does say is that Alexander grew into a man who could march for days on dried meat and stolen water, who could watch his soldiers feast while he ate the same rations they did, who could pour out the only water in a desert because drinking it would have meant admitting he needed it more than they did. That bowl of barley porridge didn't just feed him. It taught him. And what it taught him was this: desire is a weakness, hunger is a tool, and the man who controls his own stomach can control the world. But every lesson has a shadow, and the shadow of that breakfast table was a boy who learned too well that pleasure was dangerous, that indulgence was failure, that wanting something just because it tasted good was a character flaw. That shadow would follow Alexander into Persia, where the tables groaned under foods he couldn't pronounce, where wine flowed like rivers and women moved like music. He would taste it all, but he would never quite trust it, because somewhere deep inside, that boy with the bowl of porridge was still sitting there, still chewing, still watching his father's eyes. And that's the thing about breakfast. It stays with you. But breakfast was only the beginning. Because once the bowl was empty and the bread was gone, Alexander had to face the second great trial of his young life, lunch with Aristotle. And let me tell you, between the two, it wasn't always clear which one required more chewing. Imagine sitting down to eat, and across from you is a man who literally wrote the book on everything: ethics, physics, metaphysics, poetry, politics, biology. If it existed, Aristotle had an opinion on it, and he was eager to share that opinion between bites of his own modest meal. The great philosopher had been summoned to Macedonia by King Philip himself, tasked with turning a promising prince into something more. And Aristotle took that task seriously. Perhaps too seriously, if you were a teenage boy who just wanted to eat his cheese in peace. The dining room became a classroom. Every meal came with a lesson. You reached for the bread, and Aristotle quoted Plato on the nature of desire. You eyed the figs, and he launched into a discourse on moderation and the golden mean. You dared to ask for more wine, even the watered-down kind, and suddenly you were receiving a lecture on the difference between civilized men and barbarians, delivered with the kind of eye contact that made you wish you'd kept your mouth shut. But here's the thing about Aristotle's approach. It wasn't just academic theory, dressed up as dinner conversation. He genuinely believed that what you put in your body shaped what came out of your soul. Too much food, and you grew sluggish, dull, prone to indulgence. Too little, and you grew sharp, desperate, prone to cruelty. Somewhere in the middle lay the ideal. A man who ate enough to sustain his ambitions, but never so much that his ambitions grew soft. Every meal was a microcosm of leadership. Every bite was a choice. And Alexander, that hungry boy with fire in his eyes, learned. He learned that lentils were good for the soul, which was convenient because they tasted exactly like something that would be good for your soul. He learned that meat should be earned, not assumed. He learned that the best leaders didn't eat better than their men. They ate exactly what their men ate, just slower, with more intention, as if each mouthful mattered. But there was something else happening at that table, something unspoken. Aristotle wasn't just teaching Alexander about food. He was teaching him about control, about the relationship between what you consume and what consumes you, about the danger of wanting things too much. And Alexander, brilliant, burning Alexander, absorbed it all. He learned to eat without tasting, to fuel without enjoying, to treat his own body as a machine rather than a source of pleasure. The cost of that lesson wouldn't become clear until much later, when Persian palaces spread their banquets before him, and he sat among silk and gold, eating his simple bread, while dancers moved like water and wine flowed like rivers. He would watch his men lose themselves in pleasure, and he would feel nothing but the old familiar restraint, the voice of Aristotle in his ear, the memory of those long lunches where every bite was judged. Was that strength, or was it something closer to fear? The fear of losing control, of becoming soft, of proving his father right about the dangers of comfort. Alexander conquered the world, but he never quite conquered that voice at the table. He never let himself simply enjoy. Not really, not fully. And so the boy who learned philosophy over lunch grew into a man who could outmarch, outfight, and outlast anyone. But he also grew into a man who couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't let the hunger go. Because Aristotle had taught him that hunger was a tool, but no one ever taught him how to put the tool down. It was a lesson that would follow him across continents, through every battle, into every palace. And it would shape not just what he ate, but who he became. But philosophy has a way of becoming irrelevant when you're marching through a desert with 50,000 hungry men behind you. And Alexander, for all his lessons with Aristotle, was about to learn a different kind of education, one written in salt, barley, and the desperate math of survival. When the army marched, food wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't about tradition. It wasn't even really about taste. Food was about weight, about how much a man could carry on his back while also carrying a sword, a shield, and the expectation that he might need to kill someone before sunset. Every ounce mattered. Every loaf was calculated. And so the rations that fueled the greatest conquest the world had ever seen were, by any reasonable standard, absolutely terrible. Picture this: a linen pouch, sweat-stained and dust-covered, containing everything a soldier would eat for days. Inside, a chunk of barley bread baked so hard that soldiers had to soak it in water or wine just to bite through. This bread didn't go stale because it was born stale. It was created in that state, designed to survive weeks in a sack without spoiling, without softening, without showing any sign that it had ever been food at all. Some said you could use it to patch a shield in an emergency. Others claimed it worked better as a shield than actual shields. Both statements were probably true. Next to the bread, a hunk of dried meat. Goat, usually. Sometimes beef. Occasionally something that might have been bear if the army had passed through the right territory recently. The meat was salted within an inch of its existence, cured until it became more mineral than muscle, more preservation than protein. You didn't eat it so much as you chewed it until your jaw gave up and your stomach accepted the compromise. It was the kind of meat that made you appreciate hunger, because hunger at least was honest. And then there were the onions. Onions were everywhere in the Macedonian army. Soldiers carried them like talismans, like necessities, like the one reliable friend in a world of uncertainty. Onions didn't spoil. Onions didn't weigh much. Onions could be eaten raw, cooked, or used to flavor water that had spent too long in a leather bag and started making its own decisions about what it wanted to be. Onions were believed to give strength, endurance, and breath so powerful it could clear a room, which was useful in close quarters when everyone smelled exactly the same. Garlic, too. Garlic hung from belts, tucked into pouches, crushed into almost every meal. The army marched on a cloud of allium, and if you could smell them coming, you were already too late. Water was the real problem. You could carry bread, you could carry meat, but water was heavy, and heavy was slow, and slow got you killed. So the army drank from rivers when they found them, from wells when they conquered them, and from leather flasks that added their own particular flavor to every sip. Leather, sweat, dust, and whatever had been in the flask before. It was, by all accounts, an acquired taste that no one ever acquired. And here's the part that still stops me cold. Alexander ate the same thing. Not sometimes. Not when it was convenient. Always. He carried the same rations. He chewed the same bread. He drank from the same flasks. He could have demanded better. He was the king. He could have sent riders ahead for fresh provisions, for softer bread, for wine that didn't taste like the inside of a soldier's boot. He didn't. Why? Because he understood something that most leaders never learn. An army doesn't follow a man who eats better than they do. An army follows a man who suffers what they suffer, who hungers when they hunger, who chews the same terrible bread and doesn't complain. It wasn't just solidarity, it was strategy. Every bite he took beside his men was a message written in barley and salt. I am one of you. I will not ask you to endure what I will not endure myself. And they believed him. They marched for him. They died for him. They followed him across deserts and mountains, through battles and sieges, into places so far from home that home became a memory they couldn't quite trust. Because when the bread was hard and the water was foul, they looked at their king and saw him chewing the same loaf, swallowing the same doubts, pushing forward the same as they did. But here's the question that haunts me. What does it cost a man to eat like that for years? What happens to a king who never tastes softness, never knows comfort, never lets himself forget that hunger is always waiting just beyond the next meal? Alexander would find out, and the answer would come not in bread, but in wine. There's a story they tell about Alexander in the desert, and like all the best stories about him, it's probably true, probably embellished, and absolutely perfect. The army had been marching for days through country that seemed designed to kill them. Sand and rock and sky, nothing else. The sun pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, relentless and heavy. Water had run out 2 days earlier. The men were staggering now, not marching. Their tongues had swollen. Their eyes had taken on that look that officers learn to fear. The look of men who are beginning to understand that they might die here, in this empty place, far from home, far from everything. Scouts fanned out in desperation, searching for anything wet, and then, miraculously, one of them found something. Not a spring, not a stream, just a shallow depression in the rock where rainwater had collected and somehow survived the sun's attention. It wasn't much. It wasn't clean. Things had drunk from it. Things had possibly died in it, but it was water. The scout scooped what he could into his helmet, because in the Macedonian army, your helmet was your bowl, your cup, your wash basin, and occasionally your last hope, and carried it back to Alexander. Imagine that moment. The king, dust-caked and sunburned, his throat sandpaper, his men collapsing around him, and in front of him, a helmet full of water. Not cold water, not clean water, but water. Enough to wet his mouth. Enough to remind him what relief felt like. Enough to keep going. He took the helmet. He looked at the water. He looked at his men. And then, in front of everyone, he poured it out onto the sand. The water sank into the ground almost instantly, disappearing like it had never existed. And for a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They just stared at the dark patch on the earth, where their king had just emptied their last hope. Then Alexander said something. The historians argue about exactly what, but the meaning is clear. If I drink, and you cannot, then I will not drink. We march together, we thirst together, we live together, or we die together. But not one of us drinks while another suffers. It was, by any measure, the most brilliant performance of his life. Because here's what you need to understand about that moment. Alexander was dying of thirst. His men were dying of thirst. That helmet of questionable water would have kept him alive a little longer, given him strength to lead, to decide, to command. By any practical measure, he should have drunk it. His survival mattered more than any single soldier's. That's how armies work. That's how empires work. The king drinks first, because the king must live. But Alexander understood something deeper. He understood that armies don't run on water. They run on belief. They run on the conviction that the man leading them is one of them, that he feels what they feel, that he will not ask them to endure what he will not endure himself. Pouring out that water was worth more than 1,000 wells. It was a statement carved into the hearts of every man who saw it. I am you. We are the same. What we suffer, I suffer. And it worked. The men found strength they didn't know they had. They marched further. They found water eventually, or they died trying, but they marched. Because their king had poured out his last chance and asked nothing of them that he hadn't already taken upon himself. But here's the part that doesn't get told enough. That moment cost Alexander something too. Not water, something else. Every time he denied himself, every time he chose suffering over comfort, he reinforced a pattern that would follow him to the end. He learned too well that want was weakness, that need was failure, that the only safe path was the hard path. And that lesson, carved into him by 1,000 such moments, would leave him unable to rest, unable to stop, unable to ever say, enough. The helmet of water made his men love him. It also made him alone. Because when you pour out your own water in the desert, you send a message not just to your army, but to yourself. And the message is this: you don't get to want things. You don't get to need things. You only get to march. So he marched, right up to the golden tables of Persia, where the wine flowed and the food glittered, and everything he had denied himself waited in endless abundance. And there, finally, he would learn what happens when a man who has spent his whole life saying no suddenly says yes. Everything changed when Alexander walked into Persia. Not just his empire, not just his army, not even just his understanding of the world, his stomach. For years he had eaten like a soldier. Barley bread that fought back, dried meat that required negotiation, onions that cleared tents and garlic that announced his army long before the dust appeared on the horizon. He had poured out water in the desert rather than drink alone. He had sat in the dirt with his men and chewed the same rations, swallowed the same dust, endured the same hunger. It was who he was. It was how he led. But Persia was not Macedonia, and the tables of the Persian kings were not designed for men who believed that discomfort was a virtue. Imagine walking into a room where the tables themselves are works of art. Gold, not as decoration, but as tableware. Platters so heavy with roasted meat that servants carry them in pairs, sweating under the weight of lamb and goose, and something that might be peacock if peacocks could be convinced to taste as good as they looked. Bowls of rice, not the plain boiled grain that Greeks knew, but rice stained yellow with saffron, fragrant with spices that had traveled further than Alexander's army ever had. Sauces that had been simmering for days, reduced and strained and adjusted until they achieved a complexity that made Macedonian food look like fuel rather than cuisine. And the fruit. Dates, yes, but dates stuffed with nuts and rolled in honey. Pomegranates, whose seeds gleamed like rubies. Figs so ripe they practically surrendered before you bit them. Grapes that had been chilled in snow, brought down from the mountains, because the Persians, it turned out, had figured out refrigeration 2,000 years before anyone else. Wine. Not the watered-down vinegar that Macedonian soldiers drank to survive, but wine thick and dark and strong. Wine that came with its own history, its own vintage, its own expectations. Wine that you drank not to quench thirst, but to feel something. Alexander walked into this world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do with his hands. The sources tell us he ate sparingly at those first Persian banquets. He tried the saffron rice, nodded politely, reached for bread. He sampled the spiced lamb, made appropriate noises, went back to plain meat. He watched his men gorge themselves on delicacies they couldn't name, watched them drink until they forgot where they were, watched them sink into couches and laugh too loud, and reach for things that would have gotten them killed in Macedonia. And he stayed apart. Not coldly, not judgmentally, just apart. Like a man who had spent so long denying himself that he no longer remembered how to stop denying. But here's the thing about temptation. It doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It waits, it watches. It learns your patterns and your weaknesses and your secret hungers. And eventually, it finds the crack in your armor. For Alexander, that crack was small at first. A taste here, a glass there. A night when the wine went down easier than it should have. When the music sounded sweeter than it had any right to. When a pair of dark eyes across the room made him forget, just for a moment, that he was supposed to be the disciplined king, the soldier's soldier, the man who poured out water in the desert. The Persians noticed. They always notice. And they began to adjust their approach. Not with obvious temptation, nothing so crude. Just with more wine, better wine. Just with food that arrived at exactly the moment his defenses lowered. Just with company that made the old life seem lonely by comparison. And Alexander, who had conquered the world, began to learn that the hardest conquest was himself. He still ate simply most days, still sat with his officers on campaign, still refused the special treatment that Persian nobles tried to press upon him. But the line had blurred, just a little, just enough. And once the line blurs, it never quite comes back into focus. The helmet of water had made him a legend, but the tables of Persia would make him something else, something more complicated, something that historians are still trying to understand. Because the man who denied himself everything eventually had to face the question, what happens when everything is offered? What happens is Persia. What happens is wine. What happens is a slow unraveling that wouldn't become visible until it was too late. But that comes later. First, there was dinner with an enemy who never showed up.